Hello, good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to greet you today. We will start this webinar by the Global Coalition on Deinstitutionalization, ending institutionalization, amplifying our voices. It's a pleasure for us to have so many attendees for this webinar. And let me begin by thanking very much the availability and participation of Mr. Jonas Ruskus, member of the CAPD committee, who will be one of the four speakers that we have for this event. Before we move into the agenda and the substance, I just want to raise that there is interpretation in many different languages that I hope is working correctly. We have interpretation in English, Japanese, French, Spanish, Arabic, and Indonesian. And as far as I recall, there is also, or there should be also, subtitling, captioning. I can see it at least in English for now. We are proposing this, we have proposed this webinar to bring attention to the process driven and led by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to develop guidelines on deinstitutionalization, including some situations of emergency. This is a process that had started already some time ago in 2021, following the horrendous situations that we have witnessed and documented in institutions, especially in the outbreak of the COVID pandemic in 2020, which were, of course, not surprising, but which bring back the topic as a matter of urgency for states to address in order to respect the rights of persons with disabilities under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'm Juan Ignacio Pérez Bello, International Disability Alliance Advisor for Human Rights on UN Treaty Wise. I will be the moderator, and I'm happy to mention that the Global Coalition on Deinstitutionalization, composed by many organizations, including, of course, European Network for Independent Living, Inclusion International, TCI Asia, Disability Rights International, the Disability Rights Fund, and Center for Human Rights in the University of Pretoria. I hope I didn't miss anybody in the list. My apologies if I did. Got formed around April 2021 in order to support this process of the CAPD committee through different ways, including most notably the attempt to make sure that consultations with organizations of persons with disabilities themselves are as broad and as accessible as possible. This was the case for the 7 regional consultations led by the CAPD committee in the first semester of 2021. And this is also the case currently for this stage of the process. As you all might have noted, the CAPD committee launched a call for submissions on its draft guidelines on the institutionalization on May 20th in its website. And the Global Coalition, through the effort of the different members and especially with financial support of Disability Rights Fund, is and will be undertaking activities to translate to different languages the content to allow for regional consultations at this stage of the process, a little bit more informal than those of the CAPD committee in 2021, and trying to disseminate as much as possible the information in the many languages as this webinar in many languages testifies. I will move now to present briefly the agenda of speakers for this session of 1 hour. We will count, as I was mentioning, with the first intervention by Mr. Jonas Ruskus, member of the CAPD committee and chair of the working group on the institutionalization. He will enlighten us with a background of this process, the relevance of this consultation, and some heads up on the process ahead. As a second speaker, we will have Eric Rosenthal, Executive Director of Disability Rights International, also highlighting the importance of the guidelines in the context of emergencies, of course, as the current situation in Ukraine came to show us again, if we needed any reminder. Then we will count with Ms. Bhargavi Davar, Executive Director of Transforming Communities for Inclusion, highlighting the importance of an intersectional approach and a gender perspective within this process. And finally, our last speaker will be Eunice Diaz Escobar, self-advocate from Mexico, who will comment on some of the strength of the draft guidelines and the importance of participation of persons with disabilities in this consultation process. Following that, we will be happy to open for questions and answers by the attendees. We have the Q&A option within Zoom. We will try to tackle as many, and I will ask you to, if the question is directed to anybody in particular, to raise it when you pose the question. And eventually we will be able to share a little bit more information on the upcoming activities, many of which are still under planning, and we will be asking you, of course, to stay very much tuned and attentive to the news through our websites, social media, etc., etc. So without any more further ado, and I'm hoping that all the technicalities are very much in place, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Jonas Ruskus from the CAPD committee, asking him to take between 5 to 7 minutes for his intervention. Jonas, please, you have the floor.
Dear Juan Ignacio, thank you very much. Dear participants of the webinar, colleagues, friends, very happy to meet you all here on Zoom, willing to support and to contribute to the work of the CRPD committee, which works hand in hand with the Global Coalition on Deinstitutionalization in the preparation of the guidelines on deinstitutionalization. Let me start by reminding you about the purpose, process, and expected outcomes of the initiative of the CRPD committee and our collaborative work with the Global Coalition on the Deinstitutionalization. A few years ago, in 2020, the CRPD committee has decided to develop a guidance for the state parties of the CRPD, a guidance on the deinstitutionalization of persons with disabilities, with the aim to help them, the state parties, to define the purpose, plans, and steps forward to guide them to expedite the efforts on the deinstitutionalization, including in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was at its peak at that time. The reason of this initiative was that despite the obligations of the state parties of the CRPD convention, the deinstitutionalization processes in the state parties as observed by the CRPD committee, they were and still are extremely slow, or there is any progress at all. And persons with disabilities remain placed in segregated settings, including in residential and psychiatric institutions outside of mainstream society, mainstream communities, usually deprived of legal and decision-making capacity in the condition of social isolation. All the state parties have adopted fallacious approach for the deinstitutionalization through replacing institutions by replicating institutions by creating group homes, maintaining, in fact, the main features of institutions, as many reports to the committee, as well as the committee's inquiry demonstrate. not to forget emergency situations, including and particularly COVID-19 pandemic. That is the reports of civil society organizations, of stakeholders to the CRPD committee demonstrate. And it has devastating effects on persons with disabilities in institutions. Thereby, the committee considered to organize additional actions as regards its role in the promotion of the CRPD standards, including promotion of the human rights model of disability, particularly in the promotion of independent living in the community for all persons with disabilities, regardless intensity of the required support. In its 23rd session in August 2020, the CRPD committee has established its working group with the aim to prepare guidance to the state parties in all phases of deinstitutionalization to ensure that deinstitutionalization measures, plans, policies, and strategies comply with the human rights model of disability. It was also decided that one of the objectives of the working group should be the strengthening our partnership with civil society stakeholders to exchange information with them and learn from national practices, increase their capacities on human rights, and conduct joint advocacy for deinstitutionalization processes in compliance with the convention. For this purpose, the working group, with the great support of the committee's secretariat and International Disability Alliance, organized online interactions between members of the working group of the committee with organizations of persons with disabilities in different regions with the aim to increase opportunity for organizations from all regions, including those who are particularly marginalized and in institutions, to voice their experiences, opinions, proposals on how to address the institutionalization in the state parties of the CRPD. 7 extraordinary and very rich online consultations have been carried out with organizations from Central Asia and Eastern Europe, Central and South America, Africa, Asia Pacific, North America and Caribbean, European Union, Western Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. Hundreds of accounts and reports, hundreds, including in written about the situations on the institutionalization and progress regarding deinstitutionalization have been received. The extraordinary work has continued. In 2021, the CRPD committee welcomed the Global Coalition on Deinstitutionalization's pledge to contribute to the committee's mandate and invited the Global Coalition to strengthen its longer-term partnership with the committee and its working group on deinstitutionalization regarding the development of guidelines on deinstitutionalization. Here, on behalf of the CRPD committee, I would like to use the opportunity to thank the Global Coalition for their very strong and incredibly effective support to the committee in the preparation of the guidelines. Thanks to the members of the member organizations of the Global Coalition, the CRPD committee is able to launch an invitation now and call all stakeholders to contribute and make submissions to the draft guidelines on deinstitutionalization, including in emergencies. The draft guidelines is actually public, posted on the website of the CRPD committee. Please read it and provide the committee with your suggestions to the draft, including your concerns, proposals, as well on the best practices. It is important that perspectives from all regions that I mentioned above are reflected in the guidelines. Also, that diversity of perspectives of persons with disabilities is also reflected in the guidelines. Perspectives including, but not limited to, children with disabilities, women with disabilities, autistic persons, persons with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities, older persons with disabilities. Please take note about formal requirements for submission. The deadline of submissions, which is 30 June 2022. You will find all information you may need on the CRPD webpage. Our objective is to finalize the draft before our next 27th session in August, and finally to adopt the guidelines on the deinstitutionalization, including in emergencies, during the session in August 2022. So thank you very much for your incredible support and your collaborative work together. Juan Ignacio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruskus, for sharing all those informations with us and the 100 attendees that I'm reading here on the site. And thank you for highlighting how the process went, and especially more pressing for the current time, the period of the consultation, the deadline, and calling the attention to the formal requirements provided in the committee's website. Just I want to let the attendees know that from, I believe it was yesterday, the draft guidelines developed by the committee in English language are also available in unofficial versions in French and Spanish to expand the reach and the scope of the consultation. And coming soon, hopefully there will be translations to other different languages being posted soon. I would like to now give the floor to our second speaker, Mr. Eric Rosenthal, Executive Director of Disability Rights International. If you could put the video on and the mic, and please recall that as we foresee for this event, in order to allow time for questions, I will be forced to try to stick the intervention to 5 minutes approximately. Please, Eric, go ahead.
Yes, well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to present these guidelines in draft form to the public. And I'd like to just thank the incredible collaboration of the partners of the Global Coalition on Disability. We had a tremendous task of synthesizing the perspectives of activists from around the world based upon the consultations on every part of the globe, and pulling together the experience of reformers, people who have been fighting for deinstitutionalization for years, really are reflected in the quality and the insights of these guidelines. They truly do respect a practical experience. It's not just theory, it's not just law, practical experience on how people can be effectively integrated and supported in the community who have been so long segregated from society in very dangerous circumstances. Before I go into the issue of emergencies, which is so important in the drafting and application of this, let me just mention two of the many, many new insights that have been built into this these guidelines. Number one, you'll see that there's an extensive section on children, and it's so important to recognize that the challenges of deinstitutionalization of children are even more urgent than all others, given the damage that institution causes every single day to a child, and a recognition that the very definition of an institution for a child is different than that of an adult, that any placement that is not with a family, a meaningful family, not a family alternative, not a group home, but an actual place where long-term emotional bonds can be formed between a child and an adult caregiver is so essential. Anything other than a family is an institution. And as we work towards helping children grow up in a family, those practical insights are so valuable. And I'll mention one other very small but important recognition, that in terms of driving the process forward, the recognition that human rights documentation is itself important to understand the horrors of the institution and the necessity of bringing about and driving public engagement, informed practices. Human rights documentation is essential to reform, and recognizing that photographic and video evidence within institutions must be taken and must be facilitated by authorities to help inform the public and drive forward deinstitutionalization. Another one of the tiny but incredibly important insights. These guidelines were developed as a result of a global tragedy, the impact of the pandemic. No one is responsible for the virus, but we as a society, as a global community, are responsible for having segregated people with disabilities from society into institutions, We warned for years, for decades, that institutions were fundamentally dangerous. And yet we were perhaps surprised when pandemic came along and the institutions proved to be ground zero for death. The great majority of people who died in COVID were institutionalized people with disabilities. Call them nursing homes for elders. The reality is that congregate settings are inherently dangerous, and when emergencies come along, they are even more dangerous. If we ever were to believe that institutions were a place of safety, a place of care, a place of treatment, the pandemic underscored that they are a place of danger, a place of death, and that the challenges of deinstitutionalization must be met even in times of emergencies. The drafting process took into account those experiences. What do we do during the emergency? What do we do during COVID? Human rights monitoring becomes nearly impossible as the investigators themselves can't go into institutions. The processes of deinstitutionalization are halted, and our response is that cannot be. Indeed, the guidelines call for an acceleration, that there must be increased commitment to work on community integration and family inclusion during a crisis. And essentially, that crisis planning must plan for the inevitable reality of emergencies, be they natural disasters, be they pandemics, be they wars. And now in Ukraine, we are seeing that. The children have been left behind in an evacuation. DRI has just returned from Ukraine, where we've published a report on the incredible dangers of children in institutions, and adults are not far behind. The guidelines now serve, and we call on the emergency response of Ukraine to look closely at the guidelines. We cannot let people be reinstitutionalized. We must work to get them into the community immediately. And those guidelines should be taken to light by the emergency responders. Have a plan, be ready. There's no more excuses. Use those guidelines to save and protect people with disabilities in Ukraine and around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric, for highlighting those points on your side and for sharing some by the final part of your intervention of the insights also coming from the experience of DRI in Ukraine. I would like to now pass to our third speaker, Bhargavi Davar from DCI Asia. Please go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you, Juan. I start by reiterating the huge learning experience it has been working with all the partners to the Global Coalition on Deinstitutionalization. Also, the external reviewers to the process, Tina Minkowitz and Kira, other than the immense patience, encouragement, and the close learning exchanges with the CRPD working group on deinstitutionalization. On behalf of the Global Coalition on Deinstitutionalization, we are super excited to be able to share with you all some historical moments today, and thank you for joining us. Movements of persons with intellectual, psychosocial, neurodiverse identities have struggled for decades, if not a couple of centuries, under modern welfare policies to have their right to live in the community restored back to them. While many conventions upheld the right to liberty, the right to live in the community is unique to the CRPD. The committee has given a big push towards not only giving a broad guidance on deinstitutionalization and Article 19 over the last 15 years through different ways, such as the concluding observations, the general comments, so on and so forth. But now through this very detailed guidance on how to do deinstitutionalization, we hope that this will be of help to civil society organizations, human rights organizations, organizations of persons with disabilities, various policymakers and stakeholders. Despite these guidances, institutions have continued to grow, both private and public, not only for underrepresented groups of persons with disabilities, but for several other constituencies of persons with disabilities, the elderly, children, persons seen within the scope of national laws as physically infirm, legally incapable, persons who are deaf, deaf-blind, and so on and so forth. Multiple discriminations against women, indigenous people, young people, children with disabilities, those with albinism, epilepsy, neurological conditions, multiple disabilities, the elderly, those with enduring histories of psychosocial trauma, those using substances, young people exploring their identities on the gender spectrum, the LGBTQI communities, the transitioning trans persons. There is also a whole economy which seems to dissolve all human rights standards within policy around institutionalizing migrants, those who are fleeing their countries in states of humanitarian emergencies, the poor and the homeless. So unlike before, the list of people who are caught in the web of different kinds of institutions, small and big, is unimaginable today. The COVID Disability Rights Monitor most recently shows what has been historically true. This is true not only during times of the pandemic, but it was true before. And let's hope that it will not be true after the guidelines are adopted. Laws that are supposed to safeguard citizens' rights to live in the community are flimsy, but when states strengthen the laws, the horror is actually increased. A good example is the mental health law. States have an obligation to repeal. Policymakers have an obligation to not plan more barriers and human rights disasters for the future, as do the service providers. And when establishments commit horrors, they have an obligation to say sorry in a way that will acknowledge the harms caused, that will validate, that will recognize that lives have been lost, but also in a way that will validate and honor the victims past and present publicly, in a way that will stop the perpetration of violence for the future. The guidelines gives a substantive frame for thinking about reparations for harms caused and preventing harms from being caused in the future. In our peer groups over the decades, we have used several names to describe the situation when someone is subjected to what we now call disability-based detention, which is prohibited in the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We used to call it abduction, kidnap, enforced disappearance, arrest without warrant, so on and so forth. The CRPD has given guidance that there is something inherently violent, punishing, penal, and beyond treatment and rehabilitation in the actions of institutionalization and thereafter, in the lives lived and lost within institutions. We know of the central role given to OPDs to participate and engage at every step in the process. GCDI supports the committee in extensive, exhaustive outreach of this draft, making 4.3 a realization for all of us. Reach out to any of the organizations and we can support you in your consultative processes, creating accessible drafts, in submissions, so on and so forth. GCDI expresses deep gratitude.
It would seem as if the connection went off from Bhargavi. Is it just me?
No, she has gone. Yeah.
Okay. The last thing that Bhargavi was saying was expressing gratitude. So we can, I believe she was about to round up. So thank you very much, Bhargavi, if you can hear us, for the intervention and for highlighting the different points that you did, especially the participatory approach that has been done to this process. We have hopes that the document with the disability movement and all the allied organizations can lead to better and greater results. The recent experience at the European level is at least regarding a negative development of the Oviedo Protocol is potentially an example of the collective efforts and results that can take, without going into any more detail on that. And I would like to pass the floor now to our fourth speaker, if she has been able to join. For now, it seems that Eunice Diaz cannot join us due to technical issues, as I read in the chat. So thank you, colleagues, for letting me know. So it's we are passing a couple of minutes of the half an hour, and in case there were questions that attendees would like to raise, if you would like to write them in the Q&A section, if you would like to raise your hand, and I would be happy to pass you the floor in case of any questions. Please do not be shy. We have one attendee that raised the hand. So I need to go in the list, please. Here, Jenny Rosa Damayanti. Please go ahead and put forward the question. Try to be brief, and if directed to any of the speakers, please do so. Jenny, you have the floor.
Okay. Yeah. After the earthquake and tsunami in Aceh, can you hear my voice?
I can hear you, and I would assume that everybody else as well.
All right. So after the tsunami in Aceh, during the tsunami in Aceh, the highest mortality are people who are trapped in mental institution because they could not go out. So most of the patients died during the tsunami. But sadly, after the tsunami, when the international funds flooding to Aceh, a lot of international funding come to Aceh. Instead of building a more human rights based and inclusive system for persons with psychosocial disabilities in Aceh, they rebuilt the mental institution. So the question is, how do we make sure that after disaster, during the recovery, or what Sendai framework said, build back better phase, people would make sure that the life of person with psychosocial disabilities, especially, are getting better, compared to before. So, it is sad if that people before the disaster are detained in the institution, and then after the recovery phase, they go back to the institution. That's not fair at all. While other disabilities, people make sure that all the buildings, all the public housing, and etc. are accessible after the disaster. How do we make sure that for people in the institution, the recovery phase do make a better situation and better life for them? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you very much, Jenny, for your question. Happy you did not identify any particular panelist, but I would like to give the chance to Mr. Ruskus from the CPD committee in case he would like to address this question, and of course immediately afterwards to you, Eric Rosenthal from DRI, and immediately after these responses, we count with Eunice Diaz finally in the call, so we will give her the chance to do her 5 minutes presentation. So, Mr. Ruskus, in case you have any comments and reactions to this question, let us know. I hear you clicking, I believe.
Yeah, I can't start my video. Doesn't matter.
Okay.
So, doesn't matter. Just shortly, if I may respond very shortly. Sure that we'll address the issue of rebuilding institutions or building new institutions after after catastrophes, including catastrophes. You may have diverse catastrophes. You may have, as we do have in Ukraine due to the Russian aggression or tsunami, as you mentioned. Of course, that is one of the how to say, the bigger issue that we see in the state parties, whatever the region, that the states do not really realize that probably they use the situations that is a situation to rebuild, not to rebuild institutions, but to create opportunities for independent living in the community for persons with disabilities. Certainly, it will be addressed in the guidelines on deinstitutionalization, including in emergencies. Certainly. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruskus, for the reply. And we see an active chat in which people are sharing informations connected to similar events, as far as I see. Eric Rosenthal, would you like to add any remarks on this particular point before we move to Eunice Diaz? Please go ahead.
Just a brief thought, which is that emergency planning has to start before the emergency. And that one of the best uses of these guidelines is that when we set aside plans for emergency, the actors, the international agencies, the domestic emergency agencies must anticipate that institutions will be the place where the greatest dangers are, and that there will be displaced people who need shelter, and that institutions are not the place that they should receive shelter. Right now in Ukraine, we are finding this, that there are more and more displaced Ukrainians who have no place to go, and therefore they're ending up in institutions. The emergency groups were not prepared for this. And if they had the guidelines available beforehand, we'd know that emergency preparation must always include preparation for what you do with people with disabilities who are at risk of being dumped back into institutions, and how we must protect them before that happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for those remarks, and again for the contribution coming also from the recent experience on monitoring on the situation in Ukraine. We have Eunice Diaz in the call, I understand. So please, Eunice, you can take the floor for 5 minutes as the fourth speaker in this webinar. Eunice Díaz, are you there? Yes, please.
Hola, muy buenos días a todo el auditorio, a las organizaciones. Es un honor para mí estar en el tan importante evento que favorece a los derechos de las personas con discapacidad. Yo soy activista por los derechos humanos y colaboro para la DRI en eventos a nivel internacional para defender y promover los derechos de las personas con discapacidad. En esta ocasión voy a compartirles los aspectos más relevantes de las directrices de este documento que yo encontré más necesarios comentar. Les quiero compartir que yo soy una mujer y una madre con discapacidad psicosocial. En mi experiencia siendo una persona con discapacidad, he encontrado que el hecho de que las personas con discapacidad seamos recluidas arbitrariamente en instituciones perjudica a nivel severo nuestra mente, nuestras emociones, nuestra salud física. Y considero muy importante este documento, ya que he experimentado eventos muy traumáticos, al igual que mis compañeras que han estado segregadas en instituciones junto conmigo en el pasado. Considero muy importante recalcar que es urgente concientizar a los estados parte a nivel mundial de esta situación, ya que como sabemos, el hecho de estar institucionalizados nos provoca daños irreversibles. En este caso sabemos que dentro de las instituciones de cualquier tipo, ya sea psiquiátricas, orfanatos, casas hogar, cualquier tipo de institución que prive de su libertad a niñas, niños, adolescentes y adultos con discapacidad, violentan de manera interseccional muchos de nuestros derechos consagrados en la Convención. Y sabemos que dentro de estas instituciones se practican excepciones forzadas, se practican también sujeciones físicas y químicas, terapias de electroshock, terapias conversivas, también tratos crueles, degradantes e inhumanos, y incluso se llega a perder la vida. Es necesario también recalcar que no hay ninguna justificación para que las personas con discapacidad sigamos siendo segregadas en instituciones de este tipo que atentan contra nuestra dignidad, nuestra vida. Tenemos todo el derecho de vivir libremente en la comunidad y ser incluidos en ella, para lo que considero muy prioritario seguir presionando a los estados parte y concientizando para que las personas con discapacidad podamos recibir sistemas de apoyo en la comunidad en cuestión de salud, vivienda, accesibilidad, deporte, entretenimiento, comunicación, para que con todo esto podamos vivir en la comunidad, tomando nuestras decisiones y ejerciendo nuestra capacidad jurídica. El hecho de estar institucionalizados violenta de manera interseccional, muchos de nuestros derechos, y considero que este documento es un parteaguas a nivel mundial para que podamos avanzar en este proceso del cierre de instituciones peligrosas y abusivas. Por último, quisiera invitar a todas las personas con discapacidad, a los familiares, activistas y organizaciones a sumarse a estas directrices, a estos lineamientos, para que podamos trabajar en conjunto para crear un mundo inclusivo en donde se respeten de manera general y de manera consistente todos los derechos de las personas con discapacidad, ya que nosotras y nosotros tenemos el derecho de tomar nuestras decisiones y de vivir en la comunidad sin ser segregados ni discriminados, para que podamos llevar una vida feliz, digna, ya que tenemos mucho que aportar a la sociedad y podemos llevar una vida en la cual ejerzamos nuestros derechos. Y estoy muy contenta y muy emocionada y felicito a todas las organizaciones que hicieron posible este documento, porque considero que es un documento que nos va a llevar hacia un camino de inclusión y no discriminación hacia las personas con discapacidad. Les agradezco mucho por su amable atención y que sigan pasando ustedes un excelente día. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Eunice Diaz, for that intervention. Indeed, we hope, and it is within the plans of the CFPD committee, that the adopted guidelines on the institutionalization can shed light towards a better and more inclusive future for everybody, for every person with disability worldwide. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A of the Zoom. We have 14 minutes left. The first question by Yusuke Onoe: how we can do for the institutionalization of Ukraine and refugees? Well, I guess quite a broad question, and to address that quickly, I see, Eric, that you opened the camera in case you would like to do a 1 minute reflection on this, and then we can move a little bit back to the concrete process of the guidelines. Please, Eric, go ahead.
Just point out one very important provision in the guidelines, which is it says that people who are refugees, who are now no longer institutionalized, should not be returned to institutions. That is explicitly stated in the guidelines, and we are facing that situation now, where thousands of children and adults with disabilities have actually left Ukraine and may be living in circumstances that have allowed them to reconnect with communities as refugees. We have to be very careful. We would consider that a violation of the basic human rights principles to re-institutionalize them on their return. So we must plan for their full community integration on their return. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that. It's very curious how a negative situation as the one of seeking asylum and becoming a refugee in one place can actually become an opportunity for community integration. And what we need to foresee is to prevent that upon return, the person goes back into institution. That's interesting phenomenon. We have Mr. Ruskus would like to intervene before we move to the following question. Mr. Ruskus, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. That was a question about Ukraine. Yes, the committee will continue to interact as regard to Ukraine and under what is working on in the scope of its mandate. And then we will continue interact, and we are planning to organize meetings with the state parties involved in one or another way to this conflict. And certainly the issue of institutionalization will be raised here as regards refugees, internally displacement, or external. So not only we will work and organize meetings with civil society and governments of involved state parties in the conflict, but also the involved that those countries who are receiving refugees with disabilities, and certainly we will talk and we will touch upon institutionalization as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruskus, for highlighting the commitment of the CAPD committee to the situation in Ukraine. We have all been very thankful of the statement that the CAPD committee published some time ago on that situation, and we know for sure that the commitment stays on and very active. Within this call, there are many organizations concerned about the situation of persons with disabilities in Ukraine and coming out of Ukraine, and for sure there are many other initiatives as well. I would like to try to bring, given that we have 10 minutes left, to bring a little bit the attention to the guidelines. We have here an interesting, there are several questions. I'm not sure if we will be able to tackle all of them, but there is one from Nadia Haddad, sorry. This must be completed by DPOs trained and financed to interact directly. I'm more certain after some legal commitments. There's also the standard framework for action. Okay, thank you for the reference. It was actually not a question of its own. There is here now from Lucas Orilski to you, Mr. Ruskus. Could you please advise a good argument that could be used in the discussion with peoples who believe that it's better to have something than nothing? And if there will be no institutions, their inhabitants will become homeless, especially in so-called poor countries. If you could address this, Mr. Ruskus, that would be great. Thank you very much in advance.
I think the arguments about equality is really important, and about right to live on an equal basis with others. That is important. Another, for supporting equality, persons with disabilities need supports. They require supports, and especially individual supports. I think every state, poor or rich, it does not depend on the richness of the country, and but because we know very well that even in the countries, state parties of the CRPD that are rich, they do not provide necessary support for independent living. So it is not that is not the argument that the country is poor. The argument is about support to have equal opportunities, to have life equally to all, life in the communities equally to all other people, and to receive support necessary to live with in the communities on an equal basis with others. So the arguments are not necessarily like on states' budgets. The argument is about about equality and right to live on the right to live on an equal basis with others and to get support that is relevant to the context and cultural and societal context of society. So the arguments is about rights of people with disabilities, and that is, I think, that is already sufficient ground for that. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruskus, for the reply. Let's move quickly. We have 8 minutes left. So I would like to pass the floor to Bhargavi Davar to reply the question by Irit Shimrat on a database of testimonials from people in institutions. Bhargavi, would you like to address this very briefly, please?
Yes, thank you, Juan. I just want to say that the consultative process, we hope, will bring up a lot of testimonials and experiences from survivors of institutions. This is one of the big things that we're all expecting. So if there are testimonials, of course, there are worldwide testimonials from very long ago on this, but contemporary or old or whatever, people with experiences of institutionalization, women or people living inside institutions, if those can be brought out, those will be most useful for us. So by now, the COVID Disability Rights Monitor has already exposed a lot, but we still need those.
Thank you very much, Bhargavi, for that reply. And indeed, the testimonials have been very much collected through that experience of the Disability Rights Monitor in connection with COVID-19. Just to remind that at this point of this process, we're going back to focus on the guidelines. The committee, as you will find in its website, is rather seeking for comments on the usefulness and the structure and the language in terms of text and phrasing that the guidelines used. Of course, at this point, the CAPD committee itself, for the scope of the consultation process, does not require any, testimonials needs to support suggestions on the document itself. That's how I would rather put it. There is one question by our dear colleague Tina Minkowitz that I would like to pass the floor to Stephen Allen to address. Of course, Tina Minkowitz is asking on how the coalition, or what is the coalition planning for regional consultations in the short time we have. And before we pass to you, Stephen, I just want to clarify that the issues of time frames have been a challenge. And it's also connected to the structure within the OSCHR in order to put everything in time for the next CAPD committee session. With that said, please, Stephen Allen, please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a real pleasure and honor to be with you today. I wasn't planning to speak here, but I have been unbelievably encouraged to see the high level of participation in this event and in the previous consultations, and to underline that the Global Coalition on Deinstitutionalization has come together to promote the widest possible participation of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations in this process, in really to respond to one of the most systematic forms of human rights violations faced on planet Earth today by persons with disabilities. So it's a pleasure to be here. The coalition has a number of plans to support consultation events at national, regional, and international levels. But you will appreciate in the short time available, we haven't immediately got a list of these activities ready for you. However, I am very happy to say that we now have a web page up and online that is available now, which you can find at www.gc-ap.org. This is just a holding page at this point that provides you the list of the membership of the coalition and some contact details. But we intend to upload information here about all events we intend to support, as well as other versions of the guidelines that we are supporting the translation of into as many languages as possible. So that will be the place to go. Please bear with us. We hope in the next couple of days there will be a bit more information on the webpage. Thank you very much, Juan Ignacio.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for addressing that question by Tina Minkowitz. I think it's clear that we are holding this webinar as soon as we possibly could, immediately after the committee published the draft guidelines. And as I was mentioning, now available also in Spanish and French already on the website of the CAPD committee. Knowing that we and the different members of the coalition will try to hold different kinds of activities in the very short time frame, as Tina pointed out. So we hope, but we wanted at least very initially to alert everybody of this process and the deadlines and the documents and so on. And we hope that we have been able to transmit this today to all the attendees, and encourage you, of course, to provide the CAPD committee with your comments and suggestions on the concrete document in order to improve it, to make it more useful for the task of convincing and showing our countries that it's possible to advance if there is willingness and some clarity on things to prevent and mistakes not to commit, and especially rights to protect and fulfill. We see in the chat, thank you for sharing there the links, Sofia Vagnay from Validity Foundation first, the link that Stephen mentioned. And thank you also, Manel Miri, for sharing the link to the call for submissions by the CAPD committee. For now, those will be the main references. We will be the different members of the coalition sharing information as soon as it gets available. So social media as well is a possibility, but stay tuned with those two references. In case there is any questions or any consultation that you would like to do, you are free to contact the coalition to the email shown in that website, in the website shared by Sofia. We reach the hour now. I hope I didn't miss anything of the things that we had foreseen. We have a hand raised. I don't know if it was raised just now. Very quickly, Dorothy Nakato, please go ahead, but please make it very, very brief, as we need to round up and finish as we are over time. Dorothy, are you planning to intervene? So maybe it's just a hand raised by accident. So we will end here for now, but please stay tuned, write to the email in the coalition, contact the different members, and especially plan for engaging with written submissions and comments to the CAPD committee under the formal requirements that the committee put in its website. Thank you very much to all for your participation, attention, and we hope that we can all together build a very good and participatory process for the best outcome possible in August, September by the CAPD committee. Thank you very much and have a very nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.